All right, so today we are diving into the deep end of European energy security.
It's a timely topic.
It really is. And it's funny because
Yep.
it's something that we all kind of hear about, but it feels very far away. And then
Well,
suddenly we have, an incident like the Freeport LNG facility going offline in Texas,
right.
and it just throws everything into such sharp relief.
Yeah, no, it absolutely
Yeah.
does. And I think it was a BNN Bloomberg analyst I was listening to who called it
Yep.
a premise that the energy system of the world is currently in,
Wow.
which I think really kind of sums up this idea that we think things are very disconnected and then they're very much not.
Right. And it's one of those things too, I don't even think it really rose to the level of mainstream news here.
Right.
It was kind of this blip of oh yeah, that's right, natural gas is a thing.
Yeah.
But then in Europe it was this oh my God, we're in trouble situation.
Right. And it really, I mean, obviously the war in Ukraine has thrown a lot of this into sharp relief over the last year and a half, but
Yeah.
it's been a long time coming.
Yeah.
This reliance on Russian gas in Europe.
So let's rewind a little bit because I think that's a really important point is that Europe is very reliant on Russia for natural gas, but why?
Yeah.
How did we get here?
So it's not even just that Europe needs Russian gas.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously they do, but it's more a question of infrastructure at this point
Yeah.
and contracts. And, Europe has spent decades building an energy relationship with Russia that is very difficult to disentangle from.
Right. So even if we wanted to say, okay, tomorrow we're going to flip a switch and suddenly we're getting all of our gas from somewhere else,
Right.
it's just not possible.
It's just not possible. And, there are a lot of people that are trying to figure out ways to make it more possible.
Mhm.
But at the end of the day, you're talking about a very entrenched system.
Right. And especially, I mean, I remember learning about this, back in, I guess it was probably 2010, 2012, right around the time that the shale revolution was really taking off. And we were hearing all this stuff about how oh, the US is going to become energy independent. We're going to be, this massive exporter of
Right.
natural gas, and it's going to change everything.
Yeah.
But I feel like that really changed the game for Russia too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Russia saw an opening there. They had these pipelines already in place to Europe.
Right.
They saw that the U.S. was no longer going to be as reliant on imports. So they were able to kind of step into that void.
Right. So it's it wasn't even just about the gas that we were exporting. It was about the gas that we weren't importing anymore.
Exactly.
And that freed them up to be able to then send more over to Europe.
Precisely.
And so now, it's this weird situation where everyone's okay, well, the U.S. can just swoop in and be the hero and send all of our LNG exports over to Europe and problem solved.
Right.
But is it that easy?
Well, and that's a great question. And, we looked into this a lot, looking at the research from Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy. And it's a lot more complicated than that, obviously.
Well, of course.
And it's something that I think, we kind of go back and forth on this idea of is U.S. LNG the solution? Is it not? And it's more nuanced than that.
Right.
But one thing is for sure, U.S. LNG, it's expensive.
Okay.
It's very expensive. And a lot of it is already going to Asia,
Oh, interesting.
where prices are higher. So there's a big economic incentive for U.S. producers to sell to Asia.
So even if we wanted to, even if it was a perfect world and we could just be snap our fingers and be all right, all that LNG that's going to Asia now has to go to Europe.
Right.
Economically, it might not even make sense.
It might not. And that's the thing is, we tend to think about these things in very black and white terms.
Right.
But the reality is it's all driven by economics. And, if somebody's willing to pay more for your product, you're probably going to sell it to them.
Right. So it's not as simple as just having the gas. It's also about the price of the gas and who's willing to pay for it.
Absolutely.
So then if US LNG is not the magic solution here, what is? What other options does Europe have?
Yeah. So Europe has a few tricks up their sleeve, I would say.
Okay. All right. I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
So, they're not just sitting there, twiddling their thumbs. They're trying to figure this out. And one of the things that they've been doing is really trying to diversify their sources of natural gas.
Okay. So not just Russia.
Not just Russia. We're talking about places like Azerbaijan,
Okay.
the Eastern Mediterranean. There's even been some talk about, potentially looking at North Africa a little bit more.
Wow.
So really trying to kind of spread the risk, if you will.
You're really trying to kind of spread the risk, if you will.
Exactly. And it's not even just about who they're buying the gas from. It's also about how it gets there.
Okay.
So they're investing in LNG terminals so they can import liquefied natural gas from all over the world.
Okay.
They're also, looking at pipelines like
Mm.
the Southern Gas Corridor, which is this massive project that's designed to bring gas from Azerbaijan through Turkey and into Europe.
Wow. So it's like literally creating a whole new like route for this stuff to get there.
Exactly. It's like building a whole new energy highway. And it's a really ambitious project, but it shows just how serious they are about reducing their reliance on Russia.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And it makes me think of, like, I know we were talking about the Atlantic Council earlier and some of their research. Like, they really emphasize that diversification, but it sounds like they're also not afraid to use, like, kind of legal and regulatory tools as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the EU has a lot of power when it comes to things like antitrust law,
Right.
and they've been using it more and more to kind of push back against some of these, like, I guess you could call them like energy monopolies or like these situations where, Russia's had a lot of control.
Right. And I feel like we often think of, like, legal stuff as being very separate from, like, these big energy markets, but it sounds like they're very much intertwined.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think
Yeah.
about it like this. Like, you mentioned Gazprom earlier.
Right.
They've been hit with some pretty hefty antitrust investigations in recent years.
Yeah, weren't those mostly about, like, price manipulation or something like that?
Yeah, essentially the EU is accusing them of using their dominant market position to kind of artificially inflate prices.
Okay.
And, if they're successful in those investigations, it can mean huge fines for Gazprom.
Wow.
And it could also force them to change their behavior, which could have a ripple effect throughout the entire European energy market.
Wow. I had no idea that like antitrust law could be like such a powerful tool in this like energy chess match.
Oh, it's a huge deal. And it's something that I think we're going to see more and more of in the coming years as, these energy markets become even more globalized and
Mhm.
even more competitive.
Right. It's like this whole other level of strategy that I never even considered before.
Exactly. And it's not even just about antitrust.
Yeah.
The EU also has a lot of regulations in place about things like pipeline construction,
Yeah.
which can make it very difficult to build new pipelines, like the proposed South Stream project, which was supposed to bypass Ukraine.
Right.
That project was basically killed off because it didn't comply with EU regulations.
Oh, wow. So it's like they're using those regulations as a way to kind of like control the flow of energy as well.
Exactly. It's all part of this, multi-pronged approach to energy security.
Okay. And then there's the whole like energy efficiency thing, which I feel like we always hear about, but we never really like
Right.
dive into like how much of a role does that actually play in all of this?
Yeah, it's a huge deal, actually. I mean, the cheapest and most secure energy is the energy you don't use.
Right.
So Europe has been investing heavily in things like building retrofits, renewable energy sources, all these things that reduce their overall energy consumption.
So it's like a two-pronged thing. It's like we're going to use less energy,
Right.
but the energy that we do use, we're going to get it from somewhere else.
Exactly. It's all about diversification
Right.
and reducing their reliance on any one source.
Makes sense. So it's like they're playing defense and offense at the same time.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about how Europe is trying to kind of like shore up its own energy security,
Right.
but we have to remember it's not just about what Europe needs, it's about what the global gas market is offering.
That's a really important point, and it's something that I think a lot of people overlook.
And from what I understand, that market is changing like rapidly as we speak.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the biggest trends we're seeing right now is this move away from oil index pricing for LNG.
Okay. I remember us talking about that earlier, but I got to be honest with you, I don't totally understand what that means. Like,
Right.
break that down for me.
Yeah. So basically, for a long time, the price of LNG was pegged to the price of oil.
Okay.
So if oil prices went up, LNG prices went up, and vice versa.
Okay, so it's like they were kind of linked together.
Exactly. But in recent years, we've seen this big push towards more spot market pricing for LNG.
Okay, spot market pricing, that sounds very like Wall Streety. What does it actually mean?
Yeah, so basically it means that LNG is being bought and sold more like a commodity. Like, you think about like the price of gold or the price of wheat.
Okay.
It fluctuates based on supply and demand.
So it's like a much more like free-flowing kind of market.
Exactly. And it makes the market a lot more volatile, but it also creates more opportunities for both buyers and sellers.
Okay, so for Europe, what does that mean? Like, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
That's a great question. And it's kind of a double-edged sword.
All right, how so?
On the one hand, it means that Europe is no longer locked into these long-term contracts with potentially unfavorable prices.
Right, because before it was like, okay, we're going to buy this much gas from you at this price for the next like 20 years.
Exactly. But now they have more flexibility to shop around and take advantage of price fluctuations in the spot market.
Okay, I see. So it's like they have more options now.
Exactly. They have more options, but it also means that they're more exposed to price volatility.
Right. So if the price of LNG suddenly spikes,
Right.
they're going to feel it.
They're going to feel it for sure.
So what are some of the things that are driving this shift towards a more globalized
Yeah.
and spot market-based LNG market?
So one of the biggest factors is the rise of Asian demand.
Oh, interesting.
Asia is thirsty for energy, and they're willing to pay a premium for LNG.
So they're kind of like calling the shots now.
In a lot of ways they are, and that's driving up prices, and it's also making the market a lot more competitive.
Wow. I would like this whole global energy chess game is getting even more complex.
Exactly. And Europe is right in the middle of it.
You know, it's interesting because we've been talking a lot about like the economics of all of this and like the geopolitics.
Right.
But I also can't help but think about like the human element.
Right.
Like, what does all of this mean for everyday people, especially in places like Ukraine that are kind of caught in the middle of this?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that's really important to remember is that this isn't just some abstract economic or geopolitical issue.
Right.
This is about people's lives.
It's about keeping the lights on. It's about heating their homes. It's about, being able to live their lives.
Right. And for a lot of people in Ukraine, they're facing a very real energy crisis right now.
And this winter is probably going to be another rough one.
Yeah, it's a really tough situation.
It really is. And it just kind of reminds you that, like, behind all of these, like, pipelines and contracts and, like, market forces, there are real people whose lives are being impacted by these decisions.
Absolutely.
It's funny, like, we've covered so much ground today.
We really have.
Like, from literal explosions in Texas to, like,
Yeah.
legal battles happening in Brussels, and it's like this whole global energy chess game. And it's kind of overwhelming, to be honest.
It's a very complex landscape.
It really is. And it
Yeah.
makes you realize, like, even having done all this research and, like, talked to you about it, like, I still feel like I could wake up tomorrow and there could be, like, 5 new things happening that, like, completely change the game.
And that's the nature of the energy industry, right? It's
Okay.
constantly evolving. There are always new technologies,
Yeah.
new discoveries, new geopolitical developments. It's like trying to predict the weather.
And especially now, it feels like with everything going on in Ukraine and, like, the
Right.
global economy being in such a weird place, it's like,
It's interconnected.
it's way more interconnected than I think I ever realized.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting that you bring up Ukraine because I think it really highlights this tension between diversification and cooperation.
Okay. Yeah, because we've talked a lot about how Europe needs to diversify their energy sources.
Right.
But at the same time, like, is there a world in which cooperation is actually a better solution?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's something that the Atlantic Council has been grappling with as well.
Okay.
On the one hand, diversification is obviously important. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket.
Right.
But on the other hand, if countries can find ways to cooperate on energy,
Like, what would that even look like?
well, I mean, it could take many forms, right? It could be things like joint ventures to develop new energy infrastructure.
Okay.
It could be agreements on pricing and supply.
Right.
It could even be things like sharing technology and expertise.
So it's like moving away from this, like, very competitive mindset
Right.
to something that's more collaborative.
Exactly, because at the end of the day, energy security is a shared challenge.
Right. Like, if one country's energy supply gets disrupted, it can have ripple effects throughout the entire region.
Exactly. So it's in everyone's best interest to find ways to work together.
I like that idea in theory,
Yeah.
but I also feel like that's very pie in the sky, right? Like,
It's idealistic.
it's very idealistic, and it's hard to imagine, like, given the current political climate.
It's a tough sell.
It's a tough sell, but maybe it's something that, like,
Right.
we need to be striving for.
I think so, because the alternative is not very appealing.
Right, like more conflict, more instability.
Exactly. And I think at the end of the day, nobody wants that.
No, absolutely not well on that note.
Right.
Thank you so much for this deep dive.
Yeah.
This has been incredibly insightful. And like I said, even though I'm still a little overwhelmed, I feel like I understand this so much better now.
Well, that's what we're here for, right?
We
To try to make sense of these complex issues.
Absolutely. And I think you've done a fantastic job of that. So thank you.
My pleasure.
And to all of our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of European energy security. We'll catch you next